What we're going to do, we're not going to have time, of course, to look at all 20 lines of evidence that have been advanced, and there are many others that continue to be advanced. We're going to look at just 8 lines of evidence, and each of those will be looked at tonight. Some of them will be expounded upon further in the forthcoming series. I think you will find that the combined weight of these 8 proofs are exceedingly convincing and compelling, and we'll be talking more about that, of course. We're going to begin with what I consider to be perhaps the most insuperable obstacle for the atheist. I'm almost tempted to ask if anybody in here is an atheist, but I don't want to put you on the spot and assume that you are, or I don't want to have all the baggage that goes with that. But I would say, as a believer in God, as a believer in a theistic universe, for me, the most insuperable, that means the most insurmountable obstacle that the atheist faces, that is the true atheist, somebody who claims that God does not exist, he or she makes the positive assertion, God doesn't exist. Okay? That's very different, by the way, from agnosticism. That is somebody who makes the assertion, I don't know if God exists. It's A, and then the Greek word for to know, gnosis, I don't know. Atheism is quite different. A is the Greek A, which is the negative, and then theos, which is the positive assertion, God does not exist. And by the way, atheists are few and far between. There are a few radical atheists, but most atheists are humble enough to admit that it is very difficult to make an absolute positive assertion about anything in the universe, much less God's existence or non-existence. So most people today, it's not fashionable much in philosophical circles to be atheistic anymore. Most people are agnostic, and that's because atheists have realized in their humility that it's very difficult to make a positive assertion about anything's non-existence, including things that we know for certain probably don't exist, like Martians or other kinds of things. So the first one, one that I consider to be particularly compelling and perhaps the single most insuperable obstacle from my perspective this evening for the atheist, and that is what is known as the law of biogenesis. Not difficult to grasp the concept of biogenesis. In fact, a child could understand it. My little 3-year-old boy could grasp it very easily. With a raising of hands, how many of you are familiar with the concept of biogenesis or the law of what is called abiogenesis? Anybody? Okay, very few. Well, it's very easy to understand. Of course, bio comes from life. Bios, you have biology, which is the study of life, and Genesis is the beginning, just like the first book of the Bible, the beginning of something. So when you put these two words together in juxtaposition, biogenesis, you have the beginning of life. The beginning of life. That's what the word means. Now, let's just talk about that. This is what we know for certain. Now, these 3 things here are statements that 90%, I don't want to make any statistics here that I could be quoted incorrectly on, but I'm just going to use that broadly. These are statements here that a significant percentage, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of the scientific community would agree with these assertions. So we're not stepping out on any shaky ground here. This is not thin ice. Okay? And the first of those assertions is that life does not come from non-life. Okay? A la Louis Pasteur. It was believed, and I'll give you a quotation to this effect in just a moment, prior to the experimentation of Louis Pasteur, it was largely believed that life spontaneously generated, that life and rats and maggots and flies just popped out of trash. That was what was believed. Louis Pasteur, of course, demonstrated, of pasteurization fame, demonstrated that life cannot come from non-life. All that was happening is that the mice were crawling into the pile when people weren't looking and then crawling out of the pile. Or the maggots were already in some sort of form in an apple or a carrot or some trash that had already been deposited there. It was not that the trash was spontaneously generating these things, but rather these things were already there or were coming in at a time when others were not observing. So that's something we know for fact. The second thing is that the primitive idea of spontaneous generation of life is without foundation. No laboratory experiment has ever come close to demonstrating that anything like the spontaneous generation of life can happen. In fact, it's very difficult from a biochemical standpoint to even produce some of the most simple amino acids to come together, which are, of course, the building blocks of proteins, and proteins are then the building blocks of life. It's very, very difficult to demonstrate that amino acids can even come together in a spontaneous fashion, and whether or not they could ever come together to produce proteins becomes even more complex, and then you have to develop living beings out of that, and then with function, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea is patently primitive. I like to equate the idea of spontaneous generation with the old fairy tale, the princess kisses the frog, and the frog, voila, becomes some kind of a prince. That's the effective equivalent of spontaneous generation. Now, the law of biogenesis, and notice again that's in quotations because science doesn't deal in hard and fast laws. They're just called laws because the probability of proof seems to be on the side of that hypothesis. So the law of biogenesis, in quotations, has a 100% confirmation rate. That is to say, every single germane laboratory experiment that has ever been conducted in the history of humanity has upheld this fundamental scientific principle. Does that make sense, yes or no? So this thing is every bit as solid, and perhaps in some cases even more so than, for example, the law of gravity. There are some situations, of course, in which the law of gravity doesn't occur, like a vacuum or outside of the Earth's atmosphere. But so far as we know, there are no circumstances ever in the history of human science, in the history of recorded science, any experiment that has ever controverted this law of biogenesis. And it simply says, life comes only from life. Does that make sense, yes or no? Now, you can see how this presents an insuperable, I believe, or at least a difficult obstacle for the atheist or for the skeptic. And frankly, a skeptic who is honest with himself or herself will have to admit that this is a tough one. Now, of course, they believe, and I want to be fair to them, at least in part, in the Big Bang Theory. Many of them subscribe to the Big Bang Theory, and then you have this sort of coalescence of matter, and then the coalescence of a habitable planet with water and all of the constants that go into that, and then life spontaneously generates. Now, you can believe that, and you're welcome to believe that, and I won't chastise you or castigate you for believing that. All I'm saying is there is not one shred of scientific evidence to suggest that that could happen, much less that it actually has happened. Does that make sense, yes or no? The question is it even possible? And then if it was possible, you'd have to demonstrate that that's actually what happened. And evolution, atheistic evolution particularly, has fallen flat on its face here. Now you protest and say, but wait a minute. There are, practically every scientist on this campus, LCC, believes, many of them, in some version of evolution or some version of a violation of the law of abiogenesis. How do they justify that? And the answer is, they justify it not on scientific grounds. That's the point. They might believe that life spontaneously generated back from the primordial stew and even back further than that from the Big Bang. They might believe that that is possible, but they're not basing that conclusion on any scientific evidence. Are we on the same page here, yes or no? It's a faith claim. It's a faith claim to believe that life originated from non-life, because there's not one shred of scientific evidence to support that it even could happen, much less that it actually did happen, and that would be the more difficult thing to demonstrate. Just to quote to you quickly here, this is from George Wald. Some of you may know that name. George Wald, of course, was the a Nobel Prize winner. He won, I believe, the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine, if I'm not mistaken. This is back in 1954, quoted from the Scientific American, an article entitled The Origin of Life. And he said very simply, before Pasteur, the reasonable view, that is concerning the origin of life, was to believe in spontaneous generation. The only alternative, and I like this here, I like this categoric language. You'll find I'm a rather categoric person. The only alternative is to believe in a single primary act of supernatural creation. There is no third position. So here Dr. Wald lays it out in very plain language, and I appreciate that categoric language there. You basically have two options. You have the spontaneous generation of life, or you have that every bit of life that now occurs, whether it's my wife and I, we have a son, that's through the procreative act. All of that can be traced back, as he says, to a single primary act of supernatural creation which sort of got the ball rolling, and all life is now generated from that primary or that initial life-giving source. Does that make sense, yes or no? Now follow this very carefully here. We're only one step into this thing. We're only one step into this thing. But I will tell you right now, as far as strict scientific credibility goes, empirically testable statements, belief in a theistic God who is himself the beginning of life and the generator of life is a more scientifically sound statement than to believe in the non-supernatural, the natural, spontaneous generation of life from non-life. Do you follow that?